In 2025, the United States will spend nearly $1 trillion just to pay interest on its debt. Not on schools, not on hospitals, not even on its military. For the first time in modern American history, the cost of servicing the past has quietly overtaken the cost of defending the present. And that single number forces an uncomfortable question, one that rarely appears in campaign speeches or televised debates. When interest becomes larger than the Pentagon, who is really in control of the world's most powerful country? Because interest rates don't vote. They don't run for office. They don't care who wins the next election. And yet, year by year, they are rewriting America's future. To understand how the United States arrived here, you have to strip away the headlines and look at something far less dramatic than wars or elections: the mechanics of debt, time, and incentives. Public debt is often treated like an abstract figure, a number so large it loses meaning. $34 trillion, $35 trillion. The scale is numbing. But debt itself is not the problem. Countries can live with high debt for decades. Japan has proven that. What matters is the price of that debt. And that price is interest. For more than a decade after the 2008 financial crisis, the United States lived in a world of cheap money. Interest rates hovered near zero. Borrowing felt painless. Washington could run deficits without feeling the consequences. Debt piled up, but the cost of carrying it remained low. This reshaped behavior across the economy. Governments borrowed more. Corporations leveraged up. Households learned to live with mortgages, student loans, and credit cards that assumed low rates were permanent. Financial markets internalized a simple belief: money would stay cheap forever. Then came inflation. After the pandemic, trillions in stimulus collided with broken supply chains and geopolitical shocks. Prices rose faster than they had in for decades. And the Federal Reserve did what it was designed to do. It raised interest rates aggressively, repeatedly, and at historic speed. What followed was not a sudden explosion, but something slow and more dangerous: a delayed detonation. Because most U.S. government debt doesn't reprice instantly. It matures over time. Bonds issued years ago at low interest rates gradually expire. And when they do, the Treasury must refinance them at today's much higher rates. This process is called rollover. It sounds technical, even boring. But it is the engine behind the crisis. Every year, trillions of dollars of U.S. debt rollover. Debt issued at 1 or 2% is replaced with debt costing 4, 5, sometimes more. Nothing dramatic happens overnight. There is no default, no emergency vote. Just a quiet increase in interest payments month after month, year after year. By 2025, those payments approach $1 trillion annually, roughly $3 billion every single day. And unlike discretionary spending, interest is not negotiable. It cannot be delayed. It cannot be voted down. It must be paid before anything else. This is where the story turns from accounting into power, because once interest becomes one of the largest line items in the federal budget, it begins to crowd out everything else. Economists call this the crowding out effect. But its consequences are deeply human. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent on healthcare, education, infrastructure, or research. It competes directly with Social Security, Medicare, housing programs, disaster relief. It squeezes the future to honor the past, and the squeeze is uneven. Younger generations, already burdened with student debt and housing costs, inherit a system where fiscal space is shrinking. Older generations, who benefited from decades of growth financed by borrowing, are largely shielded. The political incentives follow the demographics. Cutting future investment is easier than cutting current benefits. This is how debt becomes intergenerational. At the same time, higher interest payments quietly redistribute wealth upward. The U.S. government pays interest to bondholders' pension funds, insurance companies, foreign governments, and wealthy investors. Tax revenue flows from the general population to those who own financial assets. It is a transfer that rarely appears in discussions of inequality, but it matters. When interest costs rise, inequality widens not through wages, but through the structure of finance itself, and yet, despite its scale, the interest problem remains strangely invisible in American politics. That invisibility is not accidental. Debt allows politicians to promise without paying. It delays consequences beyond election cycles. It turns hard trade-offs into future problems. In a polarized system where compromise is punished, borrowing becomes the default option. Raising taxes angers voters. Cutting spending angers voters. Borrowing angers almost no one until the bill arrives. But by the time the bill does arrive, it no longer looks like a choice. It looks like fate. The irony is that America has faced this moment before. After World War II, U.S. debt exceeded 100% of GDP, higher than it is today. But the outcome was radically different. Why? Because the post-war economy grew faster than the debt. Productivity surged. Wages rose. Manufacturing expanded. Inflation, though painful at times, helped erode the real value of what the government owed. Growth solved the debt problem. Today, that escape route looks far narrower. Productivity growth has slowed. Infrastructure is aging. Education outcomes lag behind peer countries. Political gridlock makes large-scale reform difficult, and unlike the post-war era, today's inflation is seen as an enemy to be crushed, not a tool to be tolerated. That leaves three theoretical options. The first is to raise taxes, but the scale required is enormous. Closing $1 trillion gap means politically painful decisions: higher income taxes, broader consumption taxes, or both. The second is to cut spending, but the largest programs, also security, Medicare, defense, are also the most politically protected. Cuts tend to fall on discretionary spending: housing, science, education, the future. Once again, pays. The third option is growth. Faster productivity growth would ease the burden naturally. But growth is not something a government can command. It requires long-term investment, stable institutions, and time exactly the things crowded out by rising interest costs. This is the trap, and it is not uniquely American. Japan offers a preview of what prolonged debt dependence looks like. Decades of near-zero interest rates allowed Tokyo to carry enormous debt without crisis. But the cost was stagnation. Growth slowed. Innovation lagged. The economy survived, but never truly escaped. Italy shows another path. High debt combined with limited monetary flexibility. Every budget becomes a negotiation with markets. Every political crisis triggers bond volatility. Policy space shrinks. The United Kingdom experienced a brief version of this in 2022, when a proposed tax cut triggered a bond market panic. Within days, borrowing costs surged, pensions were threatened, and the government reversed course. Markets, not voters, enforced discipline. The United States has so far avoided these constraints because of one unique advantage: the dollar as the world's reserve currency. The dollar allows the U.S. to borrow more cheaply and more freely than any other nation. Global demand for treasuries remains strong. In times of crisis, capital still flows toward America, not away from it. But reserve currency status is not a law of nature. It is built on trust in institutions, stability, and long-term solvency if interest costs continue to rise faster than growth. That trust is tested, and here, the geopolitical implications emerge. A United States constrained by debt is a United States forced to prioritize. Military commitments abroad become harder to sustain. Foreign aid becomes politically fragile. Investments in strategic technologies, energy, semiconductors, infrastructure compete directly with interest payments. Power, in the modern world, is not just about weapons, it is about flexibility, the ability to respond, to invest, to adapt. Debt reduces flexibility, interest destroys it. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans feel the effects in quieter ways. Higher rates mean higher mortgage payments. Credit card balances become harder to carry. Small businesses struggle to finance expansion. The same force draining the federal budget also tightens. Household budgets, the macro and the micro converge, and yet there is no single villain here, no conspiracy, no secret cabal. The crisis emerges from incentives layered over decades: cheap money, political avoidance, demographic change, and the belief that tomorrow will always be richer than today. The danger is not collapse. The United States is unlikely to default. The danger is something slower: erosion. An economy that spends more servicing yesterday than building tomorrow. A political system where choices shrink year by year. A society where the future is mortgaged not through catastrophe, but through convenience still. This is not a story without alternatives. History shows that debt trajectories can change. Growth can be reignited, productivity can rise, policies can shift. But only if the problem is acknowledged honestly. That means confronting uncomfortable truths. That debt is not free. That interest is power. That every year of delay narrows the range of future choices. It also means rethinking priorities not as ideological battles, but as structural necessities. Investing in productivity is not a luxury. It is the only sustainable exit. The question, then, is not whether America can afford its debt. It is whether it can afford to ignore what debt is quietly becoming. Because when interest overtakes defense, the battlefield is no longer overseas. It is inside the budget, inside the economy, inside the social contract itself. And the outcome will be decided not by a single election, but by whether a society chooses to invest in its future or continue paying indefinitely for its past. There is one more layer to this story that rarely gets discussed, because it sits at the intersection of economics, psychology, and political survival. Interest does not just constrain budgets. It reshapes behavior. When a government knows that a growing share of its revenue is already spoken for, long before any vote takes place, it changes how decisions are made. Policies become shorter term. Investments become more cautious. Risk-taking shifts from productive innovation to financial engineering. Why build something that takes 20 years to pay off when the next interest payment is due next month? This is how nations slowly trade ambition for maintenance. They stop asking what kind of economy they want to build and start asking only how to keep the system from breaking. You can see this shift in the language of politics. Campaigns stop promising transformation and start promising protection. Protect existing benefits, protect current jobs, protect today's prices. The future becomes a liability, not a goal, and this mindset seeps downward. Businesses delay expansion, infrastructure projects shrink in scope, research budgets are trimmed, education systems stagnate. None of this happens dramatically. There is no single decision that kills growth. Instead, growth dies of 1,000 small hesitations. Economists sometimes describe it feels like running fast. Wages rise, but costs rise faster. Productivity inches forward. But expectations move further ahead. Young workers are told to be patient. Even as the ladder becomes steeper and more crowded, home ownership shifts from milestone to mileage. In this environment, debt becomes normalized not just for governments, but for households. Borrowing fills the gap that growth once covered. Credit replaces income. Leverage replaces opportunity, and this is where the cycle tightens. Higher household debt makes the economy more sensitive to interest rates. Higher interest rates make debt more expensive. More income goes to servicing obligations rather than building resilience. The system becomes brittle. At the national level, the same dynamic applies. As interest consumes a larger share of federal revenue, the government becomes more exposed to market sentiment. A shift in investor confidence can ripple through budgets, politics, and foreign policy. Decisions that once belonged to elected officials increasingly respond to bond yields and auctions. This is not a loss of sovereignty in the dramatic sense. There are no foreign troops, no imposed treaties, but there is a quiet transfer of constraint from democratic debate too. Financial arithmetic, and arithmetic does not negotiate. This is why the comparison to past empires is tempting, but misleading. Rome did not fall because of compound interest. Britain did not lose global dominance because of rollover risk. The modern world operates on a different axis. Power today is mediated through balance sheets. The countries that shape the future are not just those with the strongest militaries, but those with the most fiscal room to adapt, to invest in energy transitions, demographic shifts, technological revolutions. When interest tightens that room, decline does not arrive as collapse. It arrives as delay, as missed opportunities, as a gradual acceptance that the future will be smaller than it once seemed. Yet history also offers a counterpoint. Periods of fiscal stress have sometimes produced renewal, not because the stress disappeared, but because it forced clarity. When constraints become undeniable, priorities sharpen. Waste becomes visible. Reform becomes possible. The challenge is timing. Reform undertaken early feels unnecessary and politically dangerous. Reform undertaken late feels unavoidable and socially painful. The difference between the two is measured not in ideology, but in courage. The United States still has advantages that most nations do not. A large, innovative economy, deep capital markets, a reserve currency, demographic resilience compared to peers. These are not trivial assets, but they are not guarantees. Interest does not ask whether a country is exceptional. It only asks whether the math works. And the longer the math is ignored, the more unforgiving it becomes. In the end, the story of America's rising interest burden is not just a story about debt. It is a story about time, about how long a society can postpone hard choices, and what those choices look like when they finally arrive. Because every budget is a moral document, it reveals what a country values now, and what it is willing to sacrifice later. And when interest comes first, the future is always the thing that waits.